In an interview with Playboy magazine, A Song of Ice and Fire author George R.R. Martin said, "I may write about incest, but I do not endorse it. Let us make that perfectly clear." There was this moment around 10 years ago where A Song of Ice and Fire, or Game of Thrones as the TV series was called, was one of the most talked about pieces of media ever. In my bubble, as an East Midlands sixth form student, it felt zeitgeist defining in ways that most properties never ever touched. Unfortunately, showrunners David Benioff and D.B. Weiss lost the plot when they began building the series in such a way as to capitalise on the pub reaction videos that became so popular around the airing of The Red Wedding. Every character got plot armor, all the clever characters got stupid, a lot of twists were dropped in lieu of aura moments, and then they got bored, wrapped it up, and fobbed it off so that they could go and get fired by Disney. Still, back in the golden days, Game of Thrones was catapulted to success off the back of its zero plot armor premise. Based loosely on the War of the Roses, a real 15th century war fought over the throne between the houses of Lancaster and York, A Song of Ice and Fire focuses on the conflict between the houses Lannister and Stark as they face off in a fight for the throne, a saga brimming with backstabbing, political intrigue, and, most importantly, rampant amounts of incest. Although there's dribs and drabs of sibling shagging and daughter grooming across the series, two main houses in particular in A Song of Ice and Fire commit incest. The ancient House Targaryen, which performed systematic incest that blurred the lines between keeping it in the family and straight-up sex slavery, and the current ruling House Lannister, whose incest is not so much systemic as it is endemic. We also have outlier groups like Wildling Lord Craster, who keeps a harem of daughter wives to give birth to sons that he might trade with the mythical White Walkers for his own safety. Being so rare a plot device, incest hits with a particular impact in literature because it is so taboo. You don't see it very often, so when it hits, it hits. George uses incest in his work for equal parts political satire and shock value. When young Bran Stark is shoved out of a window to his near death by the twins Cersei and Jaime, having caught them in the act of some passionless doggy style, it's a scene intended to horrify. Their framing as posh dickheads earlier in the episode initially alienated the viewer against their family, and killing a child in cold blood sealed the deal in setting their villainy in stone. In only a few scenes, we know who we are rooting against. Still, that's just the tip of the iceberg. In practice, the Lannisters' incest represents several things to the overall narrative. It represents the arrogance of the Lannister family, as their father Tywin, who married his cousin, insists a Lannister is worth more. It represents pure blood, as all of Cersei's children are Jaime's, little blonde-haired inbred angels. And key to their individual characterization, Cersei and Jaime's incest represents the concept of hating and loving oneself. Cersei and Jaime believe they are two parts of a whole person, a male side and a female side, and part of their arc is in realizing that they are quite different after all, maybe too different. In believing that they belong to one another as twins, Jaime and Cersei possess the parts of each other that they hate and love, controlling and supporting in this weird contradictory duality, never quite understanding each other. Most importantly, the incestuous Lannisters represent the way that history repeats itself, the way that monarchies begin to rot if the wheel refuses to turn. By interbreeding, by clinging to their bloodline through depraved taboo means, the gene pool stays still and turns stagnant and rotten, leading to deficiencies that manifest as madness and instability in Cersei's child Joffrey, just as they saw with the Targaryen lineage, an ancient family hailing from the now destroyed Valyrian freehold on the adjacent continent of Essos. The Targaryens' rampant inbreeding is best understood through the House of the Dragon spin-off show and is signified by their pallid skin, pure white hair, and violet eyes. Although inbreeding in our world usually ends in disfigurements like club feet and other congenital birth defects, incest has made the Targaryens a mythically beautiful family. George uses the Targaryens and their customs to subvert the old-school fantasy tropes of special bloodlines, by implying that their wish to preserve their blood is mainly just an excuse to avoid integrating with inferior local culture, and to keep their outdated customs, which, surprise surprise, allows them to take multiple wives and marry their siblings. The Targaryens don't have many women spare to bother tying big houses together through marriage and building alliances, highlighting their disdain for the cultures and customs of the people they conquer. I guess that's where the Aryan part of the name comes from. The darker reality of this is that it limits marriage freedom for their daughters and nieces, doomed to essentially be passed around the male members of the family. As a grim omen of the future for the Lannister family tree, the Targaryens' incest becomes a physical expression of their monarchical stagnancy. As birth deficiencies muddled their minds and propaganda taught the Targaryens that they were gods among men, their inbreeding destroyed them from the inside out. They became impulsive, careless, and brutal tyrants. According to King Jaehaerys II Targaryen, madness and greatness are two sides of the same coin. Every time a new Targaryen is born, the gods toss the coin in the air and the world holds its breath to see how it will land. So when George R.R. Martin was called upon as a world-building writer for Elden Ring, was there any surprise to see themes like this crop up again? In medieval literature, these unfortunate entwinements have a very high probability of ending in disaster. But that's no issue, because with Brilliant's Probability and Chance Data course, which teaches you to use probability to make better decisions, you'll have all the tools you need. Crafted by world-class teachers from MIT, Harvard, and Stanford, Brilliant's comprehensive curriculum is designed for the ages 10 to 110, with a ton of fantastic lessons focusing on maths, data science, programming, and AI. Brilliant is all about solving problems, not watching videos. You learn by doing. I personally recommend the Thinking in Code course, which comes crammed full of almost 600 exercises that challenge you to expand your logic and thinking skills, helping you build a foundation of learning that will enable you to better understand programming languages. Even if I don't use it in any actual applications, it is a great way to stay sharp. I do it in the morning with my coffee, and it gives me a kind of productivity momentum that allows me to jump into bigger tasks, like a brain wake-up call. To learn for free on Brilliant for a full 30 days, go to brilliant.org/merkkk, scan the QR code on screen, or click on the link in the description. Brilliant's also given our viewers 20% off an annual premium subscription, which gives you unlimited daily access to everything on Brilliant. So, what is incest? If you don't know, you're probably very lucky, or very fucked. Either way, incest refers to sexual activity between people who are too closely related to marry, like your siblings, parents, and children. Most people also extend this to stepfamily, so step-parents, stepchildren, step-siblings, which is called statutory incest. And it's largely agreed upon amongst psychologists that this sexual activity can range anywhere between sexual intercourse to intimate touching, to the display of sexual organs, to the verbal expression of sexual interest. Incest in literature isn't different. It follows the same definition, but across the last 2,000 years, it has often been used as shorthand allegory in everything from political subterfuge, Christian propaganda, and as twisted morals in weird fairy tales or old myths. Percy Shelley, a romantic author, suggested that incest may be the excess of love or hate. In Gothic literature, incest served to go beyond all boundaries, especially conventional law and morality. While Oedipus is one of the most famous examples of incest literature, you will be surprised to hear that its various retellings are usually far more interested in demonstrating the fallout than the crime. The Civil War, the fall of Oedipus and his mother-wife Jocasta's family, and the crisis of authority. Depending on who is telling it and why, the outcome will be different, but across the board and without exception in tales of incest, consummation ends in punishment, even if that consummation is, to put it very lightly, coerced, and that punishment is upheld for the aggressor and for the victim. Across all eras, one thing is consistent. In literature, incest is depicted as an act of pure contradiction. By blending blood with your siblings and parents, you get weaker children, your family unit becomes the most unsafe, poisonous relationships, and it is impossible to consent to because most people who knowingly engage in incest as adults do so because it was normalized for them as children, just to name a few examples. But when we're looking at themes of contradiction, opposing forces, and incompatible dualities, what better world to explore that through than the world of Elden Ring? Elden Ring's world building is crammed full of entities comprising two halves, either two individual separate pieces, like the Irises of Grace and Occultation, or two in one, two sides of the same coin, like the central monarchs of the lands between, Marika and Radagon, who inhabit the same body. The reason these dualities are contradictory is because they are often diametrically opposed. For example, Miquella is nascent, eternally youthful, whereas Malenia is eternally rotting. Mogh embraces his impure blood, whereas Morgoth rejects it. Ranni's body body dies but soul lives, whereas Godwyn's soul dies but his body lives. The most important contradiction in Elden Ring, however, sits at the centre of the current regime of the Lands Between, the Golden Order. Part political system and part religion, church and state combined into one monolithic theological movement that began the moment its ruler, Eternal Queen Marika, sealed the Rune of Death away. There's plenty to say about that, and none of it is relevant. For now, we'll focus on the two fundamentals of the Golden Order, the law of causality and the law of regression, two incantations whose existence highlights how unrefined the direction of the Golden Order was. According to their respective item descriptions, causality is the pull between meanings, that which links all things in a chain of relation, and regression is the pull of meaning, that all things yearn eternally to converge. Causality is consequence, the spreading of multiple paths, growth and change, and regression is conserving and pulling back, the opposite of progress, not only refusing to change but also pulling inwards and backwards, away from consequence, regressing to a comfortable known state. And nothing defines this contradiction more than the rulers of said Golden Order, Marika and Radagon. In the opening cinematic, we are awoken and sent in search of this shadowy figure, Marika the Eternal Queen, who seems to have disappeared. As the story continues through the towering glintstone cliffs of Leonia and the grand streets of the royal capital Leyndell, you learn about her husband, the red-haired Radagon. Eventually, you will learn that they are the same person, somehow. Ultimately, these two represent the biggest contradiction in the Elden Ring universe. Marika, the wish to destroy the Elden Ring, to move on, and Radagon, the wish to repair it, conserve, and stay. Now, all of the demigods you meet across the Lands Between are children of Marika and or Radagon. The timeline is fuzzy, but for our purposes, Marika and Radagon met long ago, got together, and had Marika's firstborn, Messmer. His sister Melina came next, although I won't die on the hill that she followed immediately. Marika attained godhood with the help of Messmer and then separated from Radagon. Marika paired up with Godfrey to birth Mogh, Morgott, and Godwyn, and Radagon with Rennala to have Rykard, Radahn, and Ranni. Two awkward breakups later, and Marika and Radagon got back together to have Miquella and Malenia. So why are they one person? One in-game argument to be made is the argument that Marika is from a village of shamans who, when flayed and shoved into jars, melt together in restless agony, so maybe she combined with Radagon in the same manner. Only the jar people we free are red raw, and the experience has driven them insane. Marika is still intact, so this doesn't track. Now, potentially Marika can use her powers of her own volition and facilitate a far gentler combination, but still the jar combos we meet are visibly multiple people fused together, like into writhing masses of skin. Marika and Radagon are more like two souls possessing one body. There is another theory, the one flesh. See, George R.R. Martin loves English history, and I'm glad somebody does. A lot of his writing satirises or straight up reflects the politics, religion, and life in Britain in the Middle Ages. According to one solid gold WordPress blog called Tower of the Hawk, a scholarly exploration of the world of George R.R. Martin, George specified in a 2011 interview that the prevalent faith of the Seven Kingdoms is of course based on the medieval Catholic Church and their central doctrine. George loves basing things off real history. The one flesh, or unitas carnis, is the old Roman Catholic belief that once a man or woman had sexual intercourse, they became one flesh, whether or not they were married, and whether or not their sexual relationship continued. If we follow this theory, Marika and Radagon had intercourse first, and Marika birthed at least Messmer, maybe Melina, and became one flesh in the process. At this point, they went their separate ways. How one goes separate ways whilst sharing a body is up for debate, but the law is very vague on how this works, and I choose to believe that they shared custody of the body, Marika and Godfrey on weekdays, Rennala and Radagon on weekends. The law of one flesh introduced one teeny tiny hiccup. Specifically, it seemed a logical consequence that the relatives of one spouse should be related by affinity to the other spouse, i.e. Marika and Rennala would have been considered sisters by blood, and Radagon and Godfrey brothers. In Christian doctrine, the unitas carnis meant that you would become a part of each other's families. Marika would have gained two new parents and any of Radagon's siblings, and vice versa. Their brother and sister-in-laws just became their brothers and sisters. Despite being considered separate people under the actual church, George R.R. Martin and the writers of Elden Ring have played this physical duality out to its fullest. Radagon and Marika's 4 children, Messmer, Melina, Malenia, and Miquella, are all cursed in some way, symbolising their inbreeding. In practice, under Unitas Canis, entire family trees would have been no-goes in the Middle Ages. It wasn't uncommon to be married to somebody for a while before learning that you're actually technically like cousins through some weird interpretation of the law. And it was up to each ecclesiastical authority as to decide how they wanted to handle those cases. The most cynical interpretation of One Flesh suggests that it was very profitable for the church to be able to dictate who you could legally marry, because if you couldn't marry anybody, your money would go to the church when you died. Now, there are many ways to interpret Marika and Radagon's self-cest. Robert Duggan, author of Our Close But Prohibited Union, wrote that Elizabethan and Jacobean dramas registered sibling incest as fed by pressure within noble families not to mix their blood with families of lesser status, citing examples from across history, from the Ptolemy dynasty of Egypt to the Habsburgs of Europe. Marika and Radagon's belligerent levels of self-cest and the incredibly strong children that resulted indicates a concentrated genetic purity, a reluctance to dilute their blood by sharing it with others. However, in all of these dramas, the warning is clear. The perverse preservation of the family, however attractive, always seems to lead to stagnation, stasis, and entropy. Don't put all your eggs in one basket. We can also compare it to works like 1839's Edgar Allan Poe's Fall of House Usher, which describes a family falling in on itself due to sibling incest, or The Fall of Camelot, which can be traced to Arthur's incestuous liaison with his sister, or the works of John Gower, a 14th century poet who used incest to represent love out of control, leading to the breakdown of family life and the common good. By the time we tarnished arrive at the lands between, the Golden Order is hanging by a thread. We are the usurpers in every ending, even if we are acting on behalf of someone else. Incest has rotted away the foundations of Marika's family. They are scattered, weak, and unaligned. Marika's imprisonment represents her stasis. She is a powerless figurehead. She reminds me of Jocasta, Oedipus's mother wife, who in many versions of the story is often the last person to die, forced to watch the collapse of her kingdom and the death of her children before she is set free. Finally, we can compare Marika to figures like Nero, Cicero, and Caligula. Charges of incest were often made in the classical world to blacken the characters of unpopular figures, especially tyrants. In Charlemagne's case, the legend of his dreadful and unconfessed sin seems to have begun very shortly after his own lifetime, when the contritionist movement was finding stories of monstrous sins to be useful ammunition. Marika's fall to incest may be the physical manifestation of the kinds of rumours that plagued the posthumous reputation of unpopular rulers. In some cases, like Periander, the tyrant of Corinth, incest is believed to be what caused him to become a tyrant in the first place. Incest was also a common metaphor for the misuse of political power, implying one considered themselves to be totally above the common good. Marika and Radagon's bond highlights their corruption. He's the head of her army and they're shagging. That's not very professional. Marika's incest, similar to the Targaryens of A Song of Ice and Fire, may also represent her inability to integrate into the political system of the lands between, how she will always be seen as an outsider by the people she rules. When we compare the Golden Order to the classic Roman Catholic structure that George bases so much of his work off, the beast folk are a clear metaphor for pagans. W.J. Thomas Mitchell wrote that animals stand for all forms of social otherness. Race, class, and gender are frequently figured in images of subhuman brutishness, bestial appetite, and servility. As we learn from the description of the Cinquedilla shortsword, the design celebrates a beast's 5 fingers, symbolic of the intelligence once granted upon their kind. The game is explicit that the beast folk are intelligent. Their clear systems of religion and government and their mastery of red lightning, magic thought to be wielded only by ancient dragons, hammers this home. Still, their constant subjugation and derogatory beast folk title tells me that this opinion is not shared by members of the Golden Order, who see them as brutish, inferior, and animalistic. Although incest is sometimes presented as a stereotypically barbarian practice, pagan communities shit on early Christians. They thought Christianity was really weird. They pounded on the Christian emphasis of love, the use of brother and sister as a standard form of address, and their communal meals or love feasts interpreted as cannibalism and incest. Pagans ripped on Christians so much that scholars argue that this was the reason why Christian writers didn't use incest as a major theme in their works until the 11th or 12th centuries, because they didn't want to draw attention to themselves, make it seem like they were protesting too hard. While the Beast Folk don't do all that much themselves, their existence as a community provides a contrast to the Golden Order. There were no instances in the game that I could find of beast incest, which highlights the recurring Golden Order incest even more. Ironically, the race considered bestial are the ones who avoid indulging in the same taboos as Marika and Radagon. The theory of unitas carnis has more interesting implications, albeit they get stretchy, so bear with me. Elizabeth Archibald, author of Incest and the Medieval Imagination, explained that in the 10th, 11th and 12th centuries, prohibitions banned sexual intercourse between all relatives connected by consanguinity or affinity to the 7th degree, and between spiritual affinity to the 4th. Consanguinity relates to people from the same family by blood to the 7th degree, counting incest as anything up to third cousins. But what is spiritual affinity? Well, spiritual affinity is based on the beliefs of the 5th century Roman Emperor Justinian, who thought that being somebody's baptismal sponsor, like being their godparent for example, would bind you into another kind of relation that he considered to be as strong as blood, and banned those marriages to the 4th degree, so god cousin or closer were off limits. This made your local community a minefield of incest. You couldn't marry your father's goddaughter because you were technically god siblings, or your godchild's mother because she was technically your mother. And the more I read, the more I understood why Henry VIII founded an entirely new church just to circumvent these ridiculous rules. Now, these rules weren't always honoured. The Middle Ages have left behind a ton of reports of people complaining to their local church that there is literally nobody in the community that they're allowed to shag, and it was up to the priests to decide when and how to enforce these rules. Some priests saw the foolishness of the idea and allowed marriages even if they were legally incestuous, and in other areas, like Rochester in Kent, some of the priests were so anal about following the rules that they were immortalised in the history books. Still, despite incest's definition stretching so far that you would struggle to find a partner without going on some holy pilgrimage of your own, this introduced a very useful get out of jail free card. Basically, if you wanted a free divorce granted by the Catholic Church, no questions asked, all you had to do was sub in as your child's godparent at their baptism. By law, you would be forced to separate from your spouse because you would now be related by spiritual affinity, and spiritual affinity trumps blood affinity. Now, this is 1000% speculation on my part, I am running with an idea, but when exploring the Mogh Dynasty, I wondered where the name came from. I know Mogh, obviously, but Win? The only other character in Elden Ring with the Win suffix is Godwin. Why would Mogh take the same suffix for his own dynasty? And if that means that Win is a suffix, then God is the prefix. And if God is the prefix, then we've got Godwin, Godric, Godroy, and Godfrey. None of these men are gods, except demigod Godwin, so you could interpret Godfrey and his family as being Godwin's god family. Maybe the reason that Marika and Godfrey split so amicably to pursue their own ends was because Godfrey offered to be the baptismal sponsor of his final child. Maybe he became Marika's brother, thus dissolving their marriage. Okay, that one was a reach, I'll give you that. Next on our roster is Inbreeding, as a discussion topic, to be clear. The Radahn family tree is a wreath, especially if we apply unitas carnis, and I think we're supposed to, because every child of Marika has traits allegorical to themes of inbreeding and or genetic diversity. Looking first at the offspring of Marika and Godfrey, Mogh and Radahn ironically are the least inbred of the group, and yet were born with physical traits that the Golden Order considers impure and cursed. These twins are both omens, which is a type of person born covered in black horns. As we learn in the time of the Crucible, before the Erd Tree and the Golden Order, omens were considered divine. Nowadays, non-royal omens will have their horns sheared off by omen killers, which usually kills them, and royal omens aren't mutilated. Instead, they are shoved down below the city of Leyndell and forced to live in the sewers, which would have been the fate of Mogh and Morgoth. You could interpret that omens represent the horn-scent race, the people who were flaying and potting Marika and her ilk, but I don't think so. Rather, it's more likely that the omens represent genetic mutations, genetic differences. They weaken the image of the royal family because they do not conform to the standards of beauty set by the Golden Order. The era of the Crucible was a time of chaos, but the Golden Order is just that. Golden Order, and Mogh and Morgoth represent neither. Still, other interpretations exist. If we base our ideas off unitas canis, especially if we consider every union Marika engages in to be self-cessed with or without a third partner, Mogh and Morgott still do represent the output of interbreeding. Maybe the Greater Will, the knower of fates, preloaded the inbreeding coded deformity because it knew what Marika and Godfrey were going to do. It's unlikely, but another possible interpretation of their appearance. The people writing early and medieval literature did not understand genetic diversity and inbreeding. They had theories, sure, but they didn't know what a chromosome was. Some of them got it. Like in Oedipus, it is stated that, as clerics saw, when blood touches blood, the resulting fruit is corrupt. But there are as many, if not more, records to the contrary. Adonis, the epitome of human beauty and beloved of Venus, is the product of father-daughter incest. In fact, in fictional texts, inbred children who survive infancy often turn out to be heroes or saints rather than monsters, and this interpretation could carry for Mogh and Morgott. Mogh becomes a cleric of the outer god, the formless mother, dying a martyr to her, innocent and manipulated, cleared of all charges. On the other hand, Morgott dedicated his life to the Golden Order, guarding the Erd Tree after all his siblings fled. When you kill him in-game, his body is visible without any omen horns, demonstrating to us that the Greater Will has removed his genetic differences, rewarding him in death as a hero. In fact, in the Middle Ages, incest was not assumed to produce defective children. The poet John Lydgate remarked that the child born of Cannace and her brother Macaraeus excelled in favour and fairness. Specifically, any deformity resulting from incest would have been interpreted as divine punishment for sin rather than biological cause and effect. This was echoed by Xenophon, student of Socrates, who wrote in his 400 BC text Memorabilia that those who transgress the unwritten law of the gods are punished by having bad children. This leaves us with two more interpretations of Mogh and Morgott. Either their physical appearance is divine punishment on Marika for her sins, or they are the output of self-cest. I'm leaning towards the former, considering Rennala and Radagon's children turned out okay. This theme of inbreeding and genetic purity is seen all across Elden Ring. One major site of inbreeding is the Shaded Castle, home to the Morai family. The castle is surrounded by poisonous, stagnant water, a metaphor for the stagnation of their gene pool. The Morai mask description states that the mask conceals a genetic sickness that the whole family possesses. Since the whole family possesses it, it's not X-linked recessive like haemophilia, which disproportionately affects males. If it were linked to dominant or recessive genetics, babies born into the Morai family would only have a 50% chance of inheriting the illness because people outside the family would not be carriers of the disease. If the whole family possesses the genetic sickness, that means that no new genes are being introduced from outside the family, which means it's like the Texas Chainsaw Massacre in there. When you compound that with the family head Malay Morai's obsession with Malenia, you have a man who probably saw her as the poster child of living with inherited chronic illness. We also have the Albinaurics, a race of man-made life forms who were constructed by the people of the Eternal Cities. These people are made from silver dew or silver tears, and every single one of them possesses the same genetic defect. After a certain point in their lives, their legs stop working and then they die. This demonstrates not a gene pool, but a gene puddle. Due to a lack of genetic diversity, they all await the same fate. This is similar to neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's, ALS, and Parkinson's, which, whilst contractable through a variety of factors, often have a genetic component. Raya is a snake girl hailing from Volcano Manor who learns that she is the offspring of Daedakar, a person who indulged in every form of adultery and wicked pleasure, giving birth to grotesque children. In the early Middle Ages, incest was rarely the term to define incest. It was often described instead as fornication or adultery or lechery. Sometimes in stories, incest is subsumed into some other sexual sin, like adultery or fornication or lechery. In this context, the use of adultery in the description of Daedakar's woe is interesting, as Raya's human form appears to have albinism, a recessive inherited genetic condition. It's possible that this was the wicked pleasure Daedakar involved herself in. Finally, we have the dragons. The dragons of today are considered pitiful in comparison to their ancient relations. They have 2 wings and 2 limbs, whereas ancient dragons had 4 wings and 4 limbs. The dragons of today also often bear genetic mutations, like feathers and bundles of overlapping fangs, and they're able to adapt to their respective environments by consuming aspects of them, like the glintstone, rot, and ice dragons we encounter on our travels through the lands between. The state of the dragons today reads to me like an allegory for genetic diversity. The ancient dragons were considered regal legal entities of myth and legend, able to wield red lightning magic. The dragons of today cannot wield red lightning magic, but they're arguably a healthier race now. They are no longer weighed down by needing to eat enough to sustain 4 enormous limbs and 4 wings, and their ease of adaptation allows them to spread out and hunt in different areas of the world. This reduces competition between them, unlike the ancient dragons of crumbling Farum Azula who lived on top of each other. The ancient dragons we see in the walls of Farum Azula look identical to Dragon Lord Placidusax, and what I find really interesting about P-Sax is their heads. In this video by Zolly the Witch, you can see that the heads are labelled male and female in the code, a parallel to Marika and Radagon, being 2 bodies in one. Potentially, Placidusax was the progenitor of all the ancient dragons, and their self-cest would have produced massive regal beasts that paddled around in a shallow, squalid gene pool. The wyverns of today may have lost their monarchy, but like pigeons, have managed to find a comfortable place in the present ecosystem. The dragons, like the omens, represent the chaos of genetic diversity, having overcome the same stagnation that rots Marika's lineage from within. Medieval writers frequently interpreted incest as original sin because they had a notoriously low opinion of female sexuality, believing that women's sexual appetites were notoriously insatiable, and like their ancestor Eve, they had no self-control. In fact, even in most stories of father-daughter incest involving rape, the young female victims would also be punished. It became a bit of a dry joke to smite father and daughter alike with thunderbolts, rendering lightning an interesting choice of weapon for the dragons of the lands between. I'm looking at you, Grandsex. Our interpretation of Marika's greed is hard to pin down because we only learn about it eons after the fact. We can see that she committed 2 genocides, taken godhood and led the Golden Order for thousands of years without passing power to the next person, an everlasting kingdom. What was she like? Was she happy? Did she want this? Was it possible to transfer power? Or was she trapped forever? Is that why she shattered the Elden Ring? We never learn the answer, and anyone who might have an answer is so repulsed by us that they attack us on sight. Original Sin is a plausible read of Elden Ring. Marika brought on an age of undying abundance in a gorgeous lush land overseen by a huge tree of the greater will that she is now crucified inside. The lands between are a once grand crumbling Eden. The shattering broke that perfect harmony and caused God to abandon her and us, and we were left to fend for ourselves in its wake, still clinging to the Golden Order and the greater will in the hope that it might return one day and fix things. Marika's fall to original sin supports the medieval belief that incest was far more prevalent than one might think. There are many stories which assume that incestuous desire is not an incredible perversion found only among barbarians, pagans, heretics, or power-mad tyrants, as well as among animals, but rather an overwhelming emotion that may strike quite normal and respectable Christians, even some previously notable for their heroism and virtue. The fact that incest is interpreted in some exemplar as original sins suggests strongly that all humans are potentially incestuous sinners. The only aspect of this interpretation that I didn't align with was the Great Serpent. Everything else, yeah, I'm totally on board with, but Eve of the first human fame shattered the spell of the Garden of Eden because she was tempted by the serpent. Why, following this metaphor, would Marika lock the serpent away? Well, firstly because Messmer has a primordial snake inside of him, a sharp red colour palette, uses a spear, connecting him to Vlad the Impaler of course, and is weak to holy damage in Phase 2. He has been cast out of Marika's heaven and now uses his fire and spears to enact endless holy war. Many design motifs point directly to Satan as an inspiration, Messmer the fallen angel, and a natural foe that Marika alienates in a self-fulfilling prophecy. But also because in a section of the Tales of Lancelot titled Agravain, the reader is told that Mordred, born of the unwitting incestuous union of King Arthur and his sister Morgause, is destined to destroy the Round Table and to kill his father, who dreamt that a snake would come out of Mordred's belly and destroy the land and himself. Not only will our player character frequently return to a place called the Round Table Hold to smith weapons and chat to NPCs, but this parallel to Messmer and Marika is too much to ignore. Messmer holds within him a great serpent that Marika is terrified of. Not only does Marika replace Messmer's eye with a grace seal, keeping the serpent locked inside her son's body, but Marika abandons Messmer inside the realm of shadow for an eternity, and it's never explained exactly why. Yeah, maybe she got busy with the shattering and her imprisonment, but Messmer's role in the genocide that allowed Marika to ascend to godhood means he's likely been waiting there since before Marika was with Godfrey. I think Marika sealed Messmer away out of fear because she thought that he would use his kindling to burn down the Erd Tree and for his association with the Serpent. Messmer's increasing disillusionment with Marika might have enabled a self-fulfilling prophecy if the opportunity had arisen. Unfortunately, we kill both of them before this can come to pass, and maybe it would have if Radahn had not held the stars in place, and fate with them. Although being the child of incest often makes you a hero, Mordred is destined to be a villain. The same can be said for Messmer, whose possession by the Great Serpent represents inbreeding deformity, but unlike Mogh and Morgott, does not die a saint and lacks the agency to be a villain. In the end, Arthurian parallels always come back to Christianity. Some critics think that incest was seen as the fatal flaw, which depicted Arthur as human and explained the downfall of his kingdom. Typical of the human condition, because incest is the worst kind of lust, symbolizing original sin. Both interpretations of Marika may be true, regardless of the role of the Great Serpent. All of Messmer's siblings are born cursed, a clear allegory for inbreeding deficiencies. What's most troubling is that these curses seem to have been placed by Marika herself, who seems to be using her children as vessels to contain her ancient enemies. Messmer contains the Great Serpent, Melina arguably hosts Marika's ancient enemy, the Gloam-eyed Queen, Malenia bears a connection to the god of rot, and Miquella, I don't know, Vati never said. These curses manifest differently too. Melina seems to be totally tied to the sites of grace, unable to leave their vicinity, and it's unknown whether she takes any form at all if there's no one to observe her, whether she's able to observe events or whether she just blips in and out at different graces like a Severance character clocking in. Malenia has been rotting alive across her extended lifespan and suffers despite centuries of efforts to keep the rot at bay. Miquella is cursed with nascence. If you're as bad at Elden Ring as I am, you will hear Malenia introduce herself a lot. She is the Blade of Miquella. Her great rune, the source of her power, should have been the strongest, but she was crippled by her rot, which grows like an unstoppable cancer across her body. By the present day, the rot has taken her limbs and her eyes. It can be kept at bay by fire and consecration, hence why Malenia dwells on the other side of the bastard consecrated snowfield, and why flaming walls have been erected in Khalid where the rot is spreading. Rot is represented in Elden Ring through stagnant water, and the world is constructed in a very intentional way to emphasize this. The eternal cities of Nokron and Nokstella are full of streams and rivers, with an emphasis on their drainage. We see an attention to detail that includes considerations of the downward flow of water into sewage grates. It takes time to design and model sewage facilities, and when you're designing for a balance of game performance and environmental storytelling, what we see is often crucial to our understanding. It's no coincidence that the Lake of Rot sits downstream from the eternal cities. We are told that an old blind swordsman sealed the god away, but it's not specified whether he beat the god in battle, or whether he was responsible for the movement of water that prevents rot spread. The blue cloth cowl states, just as still waters turn foul, stagnation leads to decay. Warriors must remain ever drifting. As the youngest member of Marika's lineage, tied with Miquella, Malenia's rot can be interpreted as the physical manifestation of the rot of the Golden Order. It has remained static and unmoving for generations, if not thousands of years. The law of regression suggests that the Order refuses to budge, but the law of causality insists that it has to. Since it refuses, it rots and its youngest child is born afflicted. Most of what we learn about Malenia indicates that she took this rot very seriously and took full responsibility for managing it. She enlisted the help of said swordsman, hence why her technique is called the waterfowl dance, who taught her to keep moving so that the rot would not settle. Her life is structured around managing this chronic illness, where she lives, who she employs, and what she wears. And yet, curiously, when Malenia is sent by Miquella to kill their half-sibling Radahn, she sacrifices her dignity to meet Radahn's measure. When the battle is turning, and it seems like Radahn might win, Malenia unleashes her rot and essentially nukes Radahn and the region of Khalid with him. When discussions of this fight crop up, it often devolves into arguments about who really won. I think these arguments are by the by. The important question to ask is, did Malenia abandon everything she'd worked her entire life to preserve because she was charmed by Miquella? It's hard to discuss Malenia without discussing Miquella. Not only are they two twins whose lives and journeys have intertwined for millennia, but Miquella's ability to charm people is so pervasive and undefined that it's impossible to write off its usage in any of Miquella's interactions. People who are charmed do not bear his mark. It's not like a tattoo. There's no way to tell until the charm is broken. Most characters are not aware that they have been charmed either. Some characters like Arnsbach are totally aware of being charmed, but not everyone is. Maybe Miquella allowed Arnsbach Arnsbach to know that he'd been charmed because Arnsbach tried to kill him, and this is Miquella's way of mocking him. Either way, Miquella has been honing his charm for a long time. The description of the bewitching branch tells us that he has learned well how to compel affection, implying that it was not always possible. As we see during the promised consort Radahn fight, he only needs to speak to you to charm you, and while this is during a grab that can be dodged, that's probably because it would be a broken ability otherwise. As we learn across the DLC, Miquella has charmed almost everyone he's met. He drops charms willy-nilly, making no effort to do things the hard way. Miquella reminds me of the character Alison Hargreaves from the Umbrella Academy, whose powers of persuasion are cast by preceding a sentence with, "I heard a rumour that." Throughout the first season, we learn that she has used her powers to earn global fame as an average actress, persuade her now husband into loving her, and she has used her ability on her children because it is quick and easy. Alison soon finds herself surrounded by people who are bitter, upset, and confused. Her husband is sitting there like, I don't know if I even love you. I don't know if any of this happened with my consent. And her relationship with her children is strained by the fact that she has used mind control on them. It's a great examination of how the power of persuasion strains relationships and how this power dynamic is too absolute to be permitted. As with much of Elden Ring, you can read into this however you like. Miquella refers to Malenia as his loyal blade, but Radahn is his lord brother, indicating that he sees his sister as a weapon. She describes him as possessing the wisdom and allure of God. He was the most fearsome Empyrean of all, suggesting that she has abandoned her ambition to fight for him instead. On the other hand, siblings do often just love each other, and Miquella has spent a lot of time trying to cure Malenia's rot, even if his curse of nascence means that a solution may never come to fruition. Malenia's adoration of Miquella could be seen through the lens of sibling incest. Being the youngest members of their family, born around the time of the Shattering, the isolation that characterized their relationship draws parallels to Sonia Harnett's story Sleeping Dogs, where, denied the chance to do so as children, the two siblings are now incapable of making outside friends. They believe that their relationship is a reward for their suffering. Robert Duggan wrote that, in the Romantic era, sibling incest was read not as perversion but as an extension and amplification of sibling love, arguably the highest form of love and devotion. Comparing it to paternal incest, so common in Gothic fiction, is evil and tyrannical. Still, that doesn't make sibling incest pure or good, and it doesn't get a free ride in fiction either. In his work Rethinking Romantic Incest, Alan Richardson pointed out, while the Romantics may have gone out of their way to valorize sibling incest and see it as a special intensification of sentimental sibling attachment, they did not go out of their way to supply the characters with a happy ending. In more cynical interpretations, sibling incest may be a strategy for the brother to preserve the mother. I think an incestuous read of these two is possible if you are so inclined to believe it, because so much of their bond is indicative of these literary traits. They were the final two siblings, isolated from Messmer by the veil and Melina by her curse. Statues around the Haligtree indicate that they were raised by Godwyn, who obviously died. Their place in a lost, isolated corner of the world represents their isolation within their own family, which, considering the other allegories for incest in this game, you would be totally within your rights to interpret how you choose. I love Miquella. You occasionally see the 2,000-year-old dragon trope in anime, which is only ever used as a device specifically to sexualize children. Miquella actually is thousands of years old, and instead of using this as an experiment to see how far you can go with fan service before your co-workers call in a tip about you, the writers of Elden Ring used Miquella's eternal youth to represent a limitation of his potential. Miquella is cursed to never finish anything. He can't finish growing, he can't resurrect Godwyn, he can't cure Malenia, and he can't become an Elden Lord. While we may see eternal youth as a blessing, for him it represents thousands of years of denial. Imagine how frustrating his life has been. As an interesting side note, 2,000-year-old dragon tropes did actually exist in medieval fiction, although instead it would be the queen's dying wish was that the king remarry someone who looks exactly like her, which was used as a device to justify and exonerate stories of father-daughter incest. Okay, so Miquella is only present in body in the base game. By the time we find him, he is a withered, naked body crammed into a cocoon, displayed on a giant pelvic bone in Mogh's living room. This is because, in an attempt to force his childlike body to grow, Miquella has cocooned himself at the base of the Haligtree. Mogh had come along and pinched him, leaving a big empty gap in the womb area of a big blonde figure built out of the roots itself. So, Freud. One of the reasons why researching incest is so frustrating is because of Sigmund Freud, an early 20th century neurologist who I always just thought was like a silly little guy with dumb theories nobody took seriously. But the more you read, the more you realise he set studies of child abuse back by probably 100 years. Because other academics just echoed his conclusions without question, framing incest as the parent's seduction by the child, or the helpless acts of the father who had nowhere else to stick it and couldn't possibly be expected to control himself. In short, in 1954, Freud described incest as being a fantasy on the part of the child, suggesting that incest was the product of a victim's seductive powers and the social thwarting of their desire, as children, to have sex with their parents. This meant that incestuous sex could only take place in a victim's imagination, fantasy, or when they provoked their parents into breaking the taboo, seduction. Thus, Freud held victims responsible. Freud was speaking baloney, obviously, but literature is a different thing to reality. A lot of incest stories are told through the Freudian perspective because it is easier to write taboo love if you create a world in which the victim is actually the one in power. Miquella is clearly written with an undertone of Freudian psychology. He is defined by the line in Freud's The Creative Writer and Daydreaming, "The motive forces of fantasies are unsatisfied wishes, and every single fantasy is the fulfillment of a wish, a correction of unsatisfying reality. Miquella is cursed with nascence and will never be satisfied by reality. His desire is all he has." According to Bulgarian-French psychoanalyst Julia Kristeva's essay on Romeo and Juliet in Tales of Love, children never outgrow incestuous leanings towards their parents, predilections that date back to long before the Oedipus complex, to that oceanic, blissful union with the mother in the womb, that loving bond with the ideal father in infancy. Basically, I don't think it's a coincidence that the woman on the wall of the Halig tree resembles Marika. Kristeva's observations on the return to the mother extend to what she calls womb and tomb. The safety she offers is thus the other face of death. The mother is seen as an inescapable power who ensures that, whatever the child's exploits in the world may be, he will always return to the womb lair and her ambiguous protection. Not only can Miquella's pelvic cocoon be compared to this, but so can Godwyn. Buried at the face of the Erd tree, tangled in the roots, Godwyn returns to the base of the tree and his life force is fed back in to be recycled. In a twisted way, with Marika crucified inside, her tomb is his womb, and vice versa. Miquella's parallels to incest don't end here. As with Marika and Radagon being two in one, Miquella is joined with a woman named St. Trina. It's unknown whether St. Trina is also nascent, or whether she has grown into an adult and left Miquella behind. We don't know where she's come from or how long they've been together, but by the time we meet St. Trina, it's clearly on the other end of the kind of breakup you go and lie in a fissure for. We've all been there, miss. Let's watch Bridesmaids. St. Trina is a tree, which is the most interesting aspect of her design by far because it draws parallels to the young princess Mira of Greek myth. Mira seduced her own father, then pregnant, fled from him. As he closed in on her, intent on killing her for her deception, she begged the gods to be freed from this mortal plane, and they acquiesced by turning her into a tree. Often the call to incest in literature is inspired by the absence of a parent, often the mother. Sometimes, like in Ian McEwan's 1978 novel The Cement Garden, 15-year-old Jack and his younger siblings are forced to adopt new roles following the death of their parents, i.e. the Oedipal scenario is fueled by confused children in dysfunctional family dynamics. Alternatively, works like Catherine Harrison's 1993 novel Exposure depict scenarios where the absence of the mother fuels the father's sexual interest and he engages in incestuous child abuse. Sometimes this is mutual, like in the 1969 novel Bouquet of Barbed Wire, where the father Peter Manson's incestuous tension with his daughter represents his yearning for a lost youth, reflecting, "The world belongs to the young, and you're a fool if you resent it. They're the new elite." Miquella's relationships can be interpreted in any of these ways. He and Malenia were the youngest of Marika's children, born around the time of the Shattering. They are the only children of Marika and Radagon to have failed to embed themselves in the political and communal sphere of life in the lands between. The Halig tree that Miquella tried to grow withered and became a husk when he was abducted, and Malenia just sleeps at its base now. Although there's evidence that Godwyn took them under his wing, they barely knew their parents and lost much more than their siblings when Godwyn was killed. The absence of the mother, and by proxy the father, is integral in understanding Miquella's actions. He chooses to follow his mother's literal footsteps to become a god, taking Radahn, the perfect blend of Radagon and Godfrey, as his consort, likely under his charm. Miquella's characterization can be compared to Prue Manson of the aforementioned Bouquet of Barbed Wire, whose childishness is emphasized but whose depiction varies between manipulative and innocent. The earlier TV series portrays her as manipulative, but the later movie, released after psychologists started to actually get serious about unpacking incest and its effects on children, portrays her as innocent. I think Miquella can be read both ways, mainly due to his depiction as nascent and being intentionally underdeveloped. Miquella isn't just physically nascent, I also believe he's mentally nascent as well. He's always in that period where his brain hasn't quite fully developed into an adult brain. A lot of his ideas are the kind of blanket approaches you see critiqued in media like Death Note, where I am 16 years old and my worldview is so correct that I am fully entitled to kill people for it, lies at the backbone of Light Yagami's character. His naive lack of empathy and inability to adapt solutions across problems, instead doing whatever he wants and expecting total praise. I will charm the world and everyone will be happy in my age of compassion, whether they want to be or not, would create a world of slaves who lack basic autonomy, and this thought process sits in shallow, childish logic. Thankfully, this guy can't get anything done. Since Miquella looks about 7 years old in the shot of him being kidnapped in the game's opening cinematic, everyone started calling Mogh a Mogh Lester, the Elden Nonce. As the Shadow of the Erdtree DLC opened our eyes to Miquella's greater plan, we learned that Mogh was actually the victim. Mogh is interesting to me because he embodies the kind of narrative timeline and payoff normally reserved for female victims of incest. He is subjugated, a second-class citizen with no hope of taking power, marginalised and owned, like Goneril in King Lear. As property of blood, her voice is framed by the patriarchal power epitomised by her sire. She is deprived of mind and body by a male discourse that constricts her female presence. Not only does Mogh spend most of his life hidden underground, but his family see him as property. Miquella charms Mogh into kidnapping and caring for him with the express intention of having him killed so that his body can be possessed by Radahn. Mogh is exploited all his life and then he is killed. In medieval literature, victims of incest were often punished just as much as their aggressors, such as in the story of Apollonius, where the king Antioch rapes his own daughter so graphically that she considers taking her own life. She is talked out of it, but is killed alongside him later. She is punished as much as he is. Like Phaedra, Mira, Candace, and Byblis, they were presented as tragic figures betrayed in love. Mogh worships the formless mother because he has no mother figure, and under her guidance he learns to love himself. He tries to build an underground civilization which attracts other outcasts, like second-generation Albinaurics. When Miquella charms him, the first member of his family to reach out with a message of love, how would Mogh know what the difference was between genuine love and a fake message behind a fake smile? He is betrayed by his brother, Miquella, who tricks him into thinking that he will take Mogh as his consort and help kickstart his new dynasty. On that note, it is impossible to assert for sure whether anyone in Miquella's life has any autonomy. While I believe Mogh could have been manipulated off the back of his naivety, it is impossible to know whether Miquella's actual consort, his brother Radahn, consented. Pier Paolo Pasolini, director of 120 Days of Sodom, wrote about his interpretation of the intertwining of desire and power. Desire has already been controlled by power. One must realize how much one has been manipulated. Love is always already contaminated. I.e., love becomes a means to an end. Even if Miquella charmed you for the right reason, his love decimates your power and becomes contaminated. After defeating the promised consort Radahn, we can watch a cutscene, a flashback, to the moment that Miquella asked Radahn to vow to be his consort. But we don't see Radahn's response, and we don't know if Miquella is using his charm ability on Radahn. I think it's impossible to know what Radahn wanted, especially when we consider that he used the gravity magic he learned in Celia to halt the stars. On one hand, yes, he did it to stop a comet hitting the lands between and opening up a big hole in the ground. Valid. But it's important to remember that the fates of the people in the lands between are determined by the stars. If you stop the stars, you stop fate, hence why Ranni asks you to kill him for her storyline to complete, as she wants to take control of her fate and begin her own age. I wonder if Radahn stopped the stars and fought Malenia off because he didn't want to be his brother's consort. If he knew he needed to die to be his brother's consort, and the stars had to be in motion for that to play out, why would he work so hard to prevent that? Also, everybody is always so quick to say, did you know he learned gravity magic so he could keep riding his horse? Isn't that so heartwarming? And I look at the horse and I'm like, that animal looks miserable and malnourished. Why the fuck is that a heartwarming story? Radahn and Miquella's relationship is interesting because there are many perspectives we can examine it through. On one hand, we have the sibling incest of myth and legend, because only mortals tended to be punished for this. The gods had a free ride. Virgil described Juno as both sister and consort of Jove. Zeus shagged his sister Demeter and then shagged the result resulting daughter Persephone, resulting in the birth of Dionysus, sometimes Zagreus. Persephone married her uncle Hades, and Zeus shagged her again then too. Although literature demonstrates that there can be no future for those who have committed incest, this arguably does not apply to the gods like Miquella and Radahn. The nurse in Seneca's play Hippolytus remarks that power breeds the desire for the forbidden. The man with too much power wants to be able to do the impossible. Miquella has absolute power over everyone in the lands between. His relationships are trivialized and hollow because of his charm. If he restrained himself from using it at every opportunity, he might have been alright, but his innate ability to turn every person into a yes man is the cognitive equivalent of being kicked in the head by a horse. Since everything is accessible, he seeks the impossible, godhood, and the subjugation of his strongest brother. Since they're both men, we can examine their relationship through the lens of male hierarchies, domination, and emasculation. Incest with homosexual themes is well explored by writer Ian McEwan, whose writing depicts a crisis of castration. Radahn is chosen like a wife, creating a crisis of his own masculinity. He doesn't speak, ever. Miquella does all the talking for him, creating a role reversal that indicates, to me at least, that Miquella controls Radahn because Radahn's power, strength, size, and masculinity have always been exactly what he wanted, and likely made him feel very inferior. Owning Radahn is to humiliate Radahn, and it is control. This relates to the writings of McEwan, where the survival of patriarchal culture depends on the disavowal of feminized flesh. Maleness must be forced into being through hatred and fear, and in The Cement Garden, Jack masks his feelings of inadequacy through violence, acting out in ways that degrade female authority, suggesting that Miquella, the picture of his mother, discards that part of himself through hateful, violent rejection, claiming Radahn, the physical 50-50 of Godfrey and Radagon. This selection of consort reminds me of Robin McKinley's 1993 Deerskin, where a father chooses his horrified daughter as his wife's replacement as a result of her close physical resemblance. At the end of the day, Elden Ring's got a bit of incest and a lot of allegorical incest. But that's not atypical for literature. Even in medieval literature, incest was often implied rather than flatly described. The cup of Elden Ring runs over with depictions of self-cest and brother consorts, but so many characters, settings, and stories can have their own incestuous readings too, be that for the purpose of highlighting sexist tropes, monarchical rot, or the stagnancy of the aristocracy. This video is long enough, and I still think there's more you could cover if you got into the real nitty-gritty. But ultimately, the question for today is, what is Elden Ring saying about incest? Which themes is the game trying to communicate through the use of incest? Well, Elden Ring uses multiple characters, relationships, and stories to make different observations. Marika's incestuous themes relate to the stagnancy of the Golden Order, and as a critique of real-life aristocracy who prize genetic similarities, alienating children who don't embody their legacy. Malenia, who should have been the strongest of Marika's children, is crippled by rot, representing the irony of breeding for purity and instead creating genetic weakness. This is echoed in the lives of the modern-day dragons, the Albinaurics, and the denizens of the Shaded Castle. Miquella's incest is a bit different. His incest represents power, domination, and manipulation, all approached through a Freudian lens, and how he uses and casts aside his own brothers to achieve his goals, humiliating and emasculating them in the process. Still, you can read into this story as much as you want to, but I hope you've enjoyed exploring how incest is used in literature with me today. In the next video, we will be discussing how the gender binary of the 2 and 3 fingers is indicated by the fact that they are each in the prime position for how men and women respectively beat their meat. Thanks for watching, I'll see you in the next one.